changed forever, Britain stood utterly alone against Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. France had crumbled in just 6 short weeks. Its proud armies overrun its cities, occupied its people stunned into submission, and its government forced into surrender. The Maginot Line, that great wall of fortifications upon which French confidence had rested, had been bypassed with terrifying speed. And now, with France defeated, Britain looked across the Channel and understood the dreadful truth she learned now. Stood in the path of the Nazi coloss, Usher armies, battered her equipment, left abandoned on the beaches of Dunkirk. Her air force is still intact, but outnumbered, her navy vast, but stretched around the globe, her spirit unbroken, but her position precarious. At this moment, Winston Churchill, the newly installed Prime Minister, gave voice to the defiance of his nation. Headed not for illusions of easy victory, nor comfort of quick peace. Instead, in his gravely voice that seemed to echo with the weight of centuries, he growled his famous vow: "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight in the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." Those words, delivered to Parliament and to the world, were not merely rhetoric. They were a declaration of intent, signal to friend and foe alike that Britain would resist to the end. Yet their reality was grim. Britain still commanded the resources of her empire. Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, India, and a host of smaller territories had all declared war on Germany within days of Britain herself. But these dominions slay thou. Sands of miles away across oceans, their military might could not be brought quickly to bear in the decisive theatre of Western Europe. Britain's position looked desperate. Hitler believed that surely such isolation would force the island nation to negotiate a peace of settlement to spare her self-destruction. Churchill, however, thought differently, and soon demonstrated his ruthless determination. On July 3, 1940, with France barely fallen, a squadron of French battleships and cruisers lay at anchor in the Algerian port of Mers el-Kebir. If the semi-mighty vessels were to fall into German hands, the balance of naval power in the Mediterranean would tip dangerously against Britain. Churchill could not take the risk. He ordered a Royal Navy task force to sail and demand that the French ships either join Britain or sail to neutral ports to be interned. The French refused, and so the Royal Navy opened fire upon it. For merrily shells roared across the harbour. Explosions ripped through steel hulls, fire engulfed the decks. 3 battleships were destroyed or severely damaged, and nearly 1,300 French sailors were killed. It was a shocking decision, ruthless and cold. But Churchill believed it necessary better to fire upon yesterday's allies than tomorrow's enemies. The message to Hitler was unmistakable. Britain would stop at nothing to survive. But Hitler was unimpressed. On July then 19th, he returned to Berlin in triumph, greeted by a crowd of more than 1 million people. He strode into the Reichstag, the German parliament, and offered peace terms to Britain. He promised that she might keep her empire if only she allowed him a free hand to dominate Europe, to conquer East and carve out living space for the German people. It was an offer cloaked in generosity, but steeped in menace. Churchill refused without hesitation. Had declared that this would be Britain's finest hour. His defiance resonated through the nation. King George VI confided in his diary that he almost felt relieved that Britain now stood alone, without all eyes to pamper or appease, for the fight would be hers and hers alone. Yet despite this resolve, the military facts were stark. The British army had survived the evacuation of Dunkirk, but in doing so had abandoned nearly all of its heavy equipment, tanks, artillery and transport vehicles. What remained was an army of rifles and determination, 25 divisions, to stand against the massed armoured columns of the most formidable war machine the world had ever seen. So while the soldiers licked their wounds, the nation prepared for defence. The beaches were mined, concrete pillboxes dotted the southern countryside, fields were obstructed with poles and wires to deter gliders, signposts were removed to confuse invaders, the Home Guard was created a volonté. Our defence force of men, too old or too young for regular service. By the end of June, nearly 1.5 million men had joined them, armed with little more than shotgun shunting rifles, oar and broom handles, until real weapons could be found. Meanwhile, Hitler pressed forward with his invasion plans. Operation Sea Lion was the code name. Some 20 divisions were to be landed across the south coast of England. Barges were gathered from every river and port in northern Europe. Hastily converted into landing craft, troops were trained in beach assaults. Maps were studied. Diet all the while the German naval chief Admiral Erich Raeder doubted success. He warned that the Royal Navy still outnumbered his forces. The English Channel could not be controlled long enough to secure safe passage. But Hermann Goering, head of the Luftwaffe, boasted otherwise. He insisted that German air power would sweep aside Britain's Royal Air Force, and once the skies were clear, the sea crossing would be simple. He promised Hitler that within weeks he could crush the RAF and open the road for invasion. And soon, July the 10th, 1940, the battle for Bar It truly began. German bombers swept across the Channel, hunting British shipping. The first phase of the battle was underway. The British response relied upon two remarkable fighter aircraft, the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. The Hurricane, rugged, steady, lethal against bombers. The Spitfire, swift, agile, the equal of the German Messerschmitt Bf 109 in speed and maneuverability. Together they formed the shield of the nation. But the shield was thin. Air Vice Marshal Hugh Dowding, head of Fighter Command, could muster fewer than 700 fighters against Goering's 2,600 German bombers and fighters. Dowding knew he could not afford to waste his slender force. He would not rise to every provocation. Instead, he resolved to fight only when essential to prevent the Luftwaffe from establishing air supremacy. Radar would be his ollie. By the 1930s, British scientists led by Robert Watson Watt had perfected the use of radio waves to detect approaching aircraft. Their invention, radar, became the cornerstone of the world's first integrated air defense system. NAS chain home network of tall towers strung along the coast, sending invisible beams across the skies, picking up aircraft at ranges of over 100 miles, reporting not just distance but directional altitude and numbers. This information streamed into Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory. There, in a vast operations room, young women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force moved countess across a grap of southern England. As controllers tracked the incoming raids, squadrons could be scrambled at the last possible moment, conserving strength. Foe. The decisive battles to come. Thus armed, Britain braced itself for the storm. On August the 13th, Eagle Day, Goering launched his great assault. German bombers filled the skies. Their escorts swarmed like hawks. Radar gave ample warning. Fighters scrambled. Spitfires diving into formation. Hurricanes roaring aloft. Dogfights erupted over the fields of Kent and Sussex. The thunder of engines, the chatter of machine guns, the sky crisscrossed with vapor trails. Bombs fell upon airfields, hangars, shattered runways, cratered. Yet by nightfall, though damaged, none were destroyed. The RAF remained in the fight. Day after day the attacks came. August the 15th saw the largest onslaught of the entire campaign. Waves of bombers forced their way across the coast. Pilots flew sortie after sortie, sometimes 7 missions in a single day. Exhaustion gnawed at them, but still they rose to meet the enemy that day alone. 90 German aircraft were destroyed. Though 42 British fighters were lost, the battle raged on for 12 relentless days. Casualties mounted. Dowding rotated his men, but there were too few replacements. Some epaulets went into combat with scarcely 10 hours flying experience. The strain was immense, the odds still grim. Then came a fateful turn. On the night of August the 24th, a formation of German bombers lost its way and mistakenly dropped its bombs upon the city of London. Civilians killed, homes burning. The first attack on a non-military target. The next night, Britain struck back. 800 bombers roared eastward to Berlin. The German capital itself felt the thunder of British retaliation. Hitler was enraged. He demanded vengeance, and Goering shifted strategy from airfields to the bombing of London. This proved a colossal mistake, for at the very moment when the RAF was close to breaking, its airfields battered, its pilots exhausted, the switch to civilian targets granted it precious breathing space. On September the 15th, another massive German assault thundered toward the capital. 100 bombers with 400 escorts in the morning. Another 150 bombers in the afternoon. Radar tracked them. Controllers scrambled every available squadron. Churchill himself observed from Fighter Command headquarters at Bentley Priory as reports crackled in the air. Alive with combat fighters clashed from the coast to the city. Bombers broke formations and some turned back, others were torn from the sky. When Churchill asked what reserves remained, the answer was chilling their air: none. But by nightfall it was clear the Luftwaffe had failed to gain control of the skies. On September the 17th, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion. The invasion of Britain was off. The Battle of Britain was won. Yet the battle did not truly end, for the Germans turned to an EU weapon, the Blitz. Night after night the bombers came. London was struck without pause for 57 consecutive nights. Thousands killed, tens of thousands wounded, entire streets flattened, fires raging through docklands and warehouses. Children evacuated, families huddled in shelters. Churchill called upon the spirit of Londoners to endure, and endure they did. In Coventry, entire city centres were obliterated. In Liverpool and Birmingham, factories and homes alike were smashed, but still Britain stood firm. Churchill spoke to the nation, never in the field. Human conflict was so much awed by so many to so few. The few, those fighter pilots who in their Spitfires and Hurricane the line and preserved the nation. They were joined by comrades from across the empire. Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, and men from occupied lands. Poles, 7 Americans who fused to wait for their country to join the fight. For Hitler, the failure over Britain was but an irritating setback. He turned his gaze eastward toward the Soviet Union, but for Britain it was survival, a chance to rebuild, to prepare to strike back. Yet survival alone was not enough. Britain needed all eyes, and above all she needed the United States. Part of Britain had survived the storm, yet survival was not victory. Her cities lay battered, her lifelines at sea were constantly threatened. Factories strained to replace the planes, tanks and guns lost in France, and her people endured nightly bombardments. The fight could goon. But to win, Churchill needed help, and there was only one power capable of giving it: the United States of America. In 1840, the United States stood aloof across the Atlantic. She had recovered from the Great Depression. Her industry was booming, her population vast, the resources almost limitless. Yet the American people were resolutely opposed to joining another European war. The scars of 1914 still burned deeply in memory. In poll after poll, only a small fraction, barely 8%, declared themselves willing to enter the conflict. Roosevelt, the president, knew this and understood the delicate balance he must strike. Franklin Delano Roosevelt had long admired Churchill. They had corresponded for years, sharing a mutual fascination with these and with naval matters. Roosevelt had been Undersecretary of the Navy during the First World War. Churchill had commanded the Admiralty. Both men understood the importance of ships, and both knew that the oceans now formed the frontier between tyranny and freedom. Roosevelt, though warm and avuncular in public, harbored no illusion. She saw clearly that Hitler's aggression would not be confined to Europe forever. Sooner or later, America would be drawn into the struggle. He therefore began carefully, slowly shaping opinion at home. He spoke of defending American civilization, of protecting freedoms that defined the nation. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, freedom from fear. In his speeches, these four freedoms became the pillars of his case. If they were to survive, then America must help those already fighting to preserve them, Britain foremost among them. Step by step, Roosevelt prepared. First came a vast expansion of the United States. Navy 6 great battleships were ordered, new aircraft carriers laid down. Then came the calling up of the National Guard and reserves for a year's active duty. The beginnings of aerial army. Slowly America's martial strength stir. From its slumber in September 1940, Roosevelt struck a deal with Churchill. 50 American destroyers, relics of the last war, but still seaworthy, were transferred to Britain. In return, America received leases on British bases in Newfoundland, Bermuda and the Caribbean. It was a masterstroke. Britain gained desperately needed escorts for her convoys. America gained footholds across the Atlantic that would prove invaluable. Later still, Roosevelt moved carefully. He faced isolationist opposition, strong and vocal among them the American ambassador. In London, Joseph Kennedy, an Irish Catholic businessman, despised Britain and loudly proclaimed that she was finished, that she would soon surrender. His pessimism soured relations and earned him chilled scorn, but others in America were moved by Britain's endurance. The sight of London night after night during the Blitz stirred sympathy. The broadcasts of Edward R. Murrow for CBS, with his quiet voice describing bombs whistling through the night, carried the struggle into American homes. People began to feel that Britain's fight was the fight too. In November 1940, Roosevelt was re-elected to an unprecedented third term, defeating Wendell Willkie, the candidate of the isolationists. It was a sign that the American people trusted him to steer the nation through the gathering storm. With his victory, Roosevelt pressed forward. In December, he delivered his famous Arsenal of Democracy speech, declaring that America must become the supplier of weapons to all those resisting aggression. "We shall send you," he promised, "in ever-increasing numbers, ships, planes, tanks, guns. That is our purpose." And our pledge. This commitment took form in March 1941 with the passing of the Lend-Lease Act. America would supply Britain, and China, still resisting Japan with war material payment, would be deferred or even waived. Roosevelt, like Ned, to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. "You would not ask him to pay before you deliver the weapons," began to flow. Rifle trucks, ammunition, aircraft, tanks, food by the thousands of tons. Britain's lifeline strengthened. Still, Roosevelt knew the path to war was dangerous. Many Americans resigned. Butte events forced his hand. The United States Navy took on more active duties in April. U.S. forces occupied Greenland in July. They replaced the British garrison in Iceland. From their American destroyers began escorting convoys, part of the Pan-American Security Zone, meant to protect neutral shipping. But collisions with the German U-boats were inevitable. On September the 4th, 1941, the destroyer USS Greer clashed with a German submarine after depth charging it for hours. Its Cape done scathed, but Roosevelt addressed the nation, grilly declaring that American vessels had the right to defend themselves. In November, the destroyer USS Reuben James was torpedoed and sunk. 100 men were lost. American blood spilled in the Atlantic. Thought the nation still clung to peace. Britain meanwhile had found another weapon far from the public gaze in a quiet Buckinghamshire estate. A secret war was being fought Bletchley Park outwardly, just another country house within its wall. However, Britain's finest minds wrestled with the most complex puzzle of the age, the German Enigma code since then. In the 1830s, the German armed forces had used the Enigma machine to encrypt their messages. A portable device of rotors, wires and lamps, it seemed unbreakable. Each keystroke produced one of 150 million possible outcomes. The Germans were confident it was secure, but in Poland, before the war, brilliant mathematicians had made the first breakthrough, said by documents smuggled from the German cipher office. They reconstructed our machine and began reading messages in July 1939. With war looming, they shared our secrets with Britain and France. Just weeks before their own country was overrun, those precious gifts reached Bletchley and the task passed into British hands. There, Alan Turing, a young mathematician from Cambridge, conceived of machines capable of testing thousands of possibilities. At once, his bomber machines whirred day and night, chasing the ever-changing keys of Enigma. The task was immense. Each midnight, the Germans altered their settings, yet slowly. Bletchley prevailed. Intercepted messages were decrypted, translated, analysed and dispatched to sea. Armandus in the field, Chill named the product Ultra, and guarded it with utmost secrecy. No action could ever be taken, unless another source could be contrived, lest the Germans suspect their cipher was broken. The results were astonishing. Convoys rerouted. U-boat shunted. Luff for plans uncovered. Ultra became the invisible weapon that underpinned Britain's survival. Its first fruits had been felt already during the Battle of Britain, where intelligence on German strategy confirmed Dowding's cautious tactics, and in the Atlantic, where knowledge of boat movements began to turn the tide. Later, its impact would grow still greater, but even in 1841, it gave Britain the confidence that she was not entirely blind in the dark. Still, Churchill was not content to sit behind his land wall. She wanted to strike back. He demanded action, raids, diversions, attacks that would show the world Britain remained aggressive and unbowed. Thus were born the Commandos. Volunteers strained for daring assaults across the Channel. Their first major raid fell upon the Norwegian Lofoten Islands in March 1941. They stormed ashore, destroyed factories producing oil for explosives, sank shipping and captured hundreds of prisoners and collaborators. Most crucially, they seized spare parts for an Enigma machine left behind by panicked Germans, a treasure beyond price for the cryptographers at Bletchley. More raids followed, some costly, some successful. In December, they struck at Vagsø, another Norwegian port. Fierce fighting erupted. Factories were blown up, ships sunk. The raids convinced Hitler that Britain might attempt a full-scale invasion of Norway, and so he tied 250,000 troops there for the rest of the war forces that could have been decisive elsewhere. Churchill considered that a victory enough. Beyond raids, Britain fostered resistance across occupied Europe. In July 1440, he created the Special Operations Executive, whose task he described as to set Europe ablaze. Its agents, men and women alike, parachuted into France, the Low Countries and beyond, to organize as a battalion, coordinate intelligence and prepare for the day of liberation. Their lives were perilous. Radios betrayed by direction. Enfinding spies betrayed by double agents, captured, tortured, executed. Many paid the ultimate price. Yet the networks they wove lived the flame of hope. The BBC too carried messages across the airwaves, nightly news bulletins in French, Dutch, Czech, German, voices of truth cutting through the fog of Nazi propaganda. Code phrases slipped into broadcasts, signalled resistance cells to act, all this under the shadow of the Gestapo and the gallows, but still people tuned in, risking death to heart. The words London calling. And then in June 1941 came the Great Transformation, Operation Barbarossa. Hitler launched his vast invasion of the Soviet Union. Suddenly, Britain was no longer alone. A new ally entered the war, brutal, authoritarian, mistrusted, but immense in strength, the Soviet Union. The ideological gulf between Churchill and Stalin was vast, but necessity for Jed's strange friendships. Churchill declared that if Hitler invaded hell, he would at least make a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. Britain and Russia now stood together, soon to be joined by the United States. For Britain, the easy developments offered hope. For the first time since the fall of France, the Island was no longer a solitary fortress. Her skies secured by the bravery of the few, codes cracked by the brilliance of Bletchley, her shores defended by the Home Guard, her enemy now embroiled in the vast Eastern Front, and her future tied ever closer to the great arsenal across the Atlantic. The struggle was far from over. The Blitz still raged. The U-boats prowled the convoys. The battles in North Africa ebbed and flowed. But the darkest hour had passed. Britain had endured the storm, and aught their road ahead would be long and bloody. There was now a path to ultimate victory for Jed, by defiances sustained by allies, illuminated by intelligence, and fought by men and women in every corner of the globe. The story of Britain's survival in 1840 and 1941 was not only the story of a nation. At war it was the story of democracy's last bastion standing firm until the world could rally to its side, and that stand would change history forever.